My beacon was never meant for Earth. I want that on the record before anything else, because by the end of it there were people who assumed I'd known, who assumed some part of me had aimed for them on purpose, and I hadn't. I was a junior comms officer with a cracked rib and a burned hand, kneeling in the wreck of a survey ship, trying to send 411 words to my own fleet command. What Earth got was static, corrupted header data, and 2 digits that had come loose somewhere in the crash. The Halbrand Vire had been mapping Amoris 9 for 11 days when the ground came up to meet us. Survey work, low priority, the kind of assignment they give a crew still cutting its teeth. Captain Dorn Kessel called it a soft world, thick canopy, high oxygen, nothing on the manifest to suggest what actually lived under that green ceiling. The descent profile had looked clean, right up until an updraft off the canopy sheared us sideways into a ridgeline we hadn't mapped yet, and the hull came apart the way hulls do when the ship was never built to be a ground vehicle. I remember the noise more than the impact, a long tearing sound that didn't stop when I expected it to stop. We found out what actually lived under that canopy in the first hour after the crash, when the ridge runners came out of the tree line in a pack of 9 and took our supply engineer before anyone got a rifle up. They were low to the ground, fast in short bursts, built long through the jaw in a way that made the noise they made sound wrong for their size. Kessel put 2 of them down with the flare gun before they broke off, and for a while we thought that was the worst of it. It wasn't. They didn't leave. They watched the wreck from the tree line in shifts, the way something patient watches a wound it knows will open again. There were 6 of us left by the second night. Kessel, with a shattered leg he refused to acknowledge as shattered. Ido Cray, our medic, rationing a kit built for microfractures and radiation, not claw wounds 4 fingers deep. Belu Sorn, our systems tech, who kept the Rex reactor core stable with wiring never designed to be spliced by hand, and me, working the comms rig that had survived the impact only because it had been strapped to my chest when the hull tore open. The ridge runners hunted at night. That was the shape of it. Daylight for repairs, sleep, wound checking, dusk for barricading the hull breach with what was left of the cargo containers, night for listening to them circle, testing the perimeter, occasionally screaming in a register that made my back teeth ache. We lost Sorn on the 3rd night, Cray on the 4th. By the 5th morning it was Kessel and me, and Kessel could no longer stand. I sent the beacon on the 2nd day, before we understood how bad it would get. It was supposed to be simple: location, casualty count, threat assessment, fleet designation, all of it wrapped around our return address header, so Expeditionary Command would know exactly which corvette to send, and exactly where to send it. I checked the packet twice before transmission. I did not check it a 3rd time, because Sorn was already dying by then, and there wasn't a 3rd time to spare. What I didn't know, what none of us knew until much later, reading the diagnostic logs off a wreck that would eventually get towed for salvage, was that the crash had scrambled 2 digits in that header. Not the coordinates of the planet, the return address, the origin marker that told any receiving station which corner of coalition space to route a response toward. 2 digits, transposed, in a field nobody thinks to double-check, because nobody imagines a machine getting its own name wrong. The beacon went out. It did not go to Expeditionary Command. It went, garbled and low power and bleeding into 3 adjacent frequency bands, into a stretch of monitored space that belonged to something called Earth. I want to be honest about what I expected, in case anyone reading this later assumes I was calm about any of it. I expected nothing. 4 days is not enough time for a fleet response even under ideal conditions, and these were not ideal conditions. I kept transmitting because the alternative was sitting in the dark listening to Kessel's breathing get shallower, and because doing the job was the only thing left that felt like mine to do. On the 5th morning, the rig chimed with an incoming packet, small, dense, addressed not to the Halbrand Vire's registry, but to the vessel broadcasting on this signature. No fleet transponder, no escort profile, no arrival estimate for anything at all. Just data, compressed, cleanly formatted, arriving the way a filing cabinet might arrive if a filing cabinet could fly. It took me 40 minutes to decompress and read the whole of it, because I kept stopping to reread the header, certain I'd misparsed something. Earth. Not a fleet designation I recognized, not a coalition member world, not anything in our threat catalog or our alliance catalog either, just a name, attached to a packet that contained, in order, A structural bracing schematic scaled to our hull's exact stress points, cross-referenced against the debris field their listening post had apparently modeled from the beacon's own damage telemetry. A chemical compound, buildable from 6 items on our own supply manifest, that their records flagged as an effective deterrent against exactly the class of pack predator our beacon's threat log described, and a medical protocol for treating puncture trauma in a physiology their database admitted, in a footnote, it had never directly examined, but had extrapolated from what our own beacon had transmitted about Cray's condition before Cray died. There was no ship, there was no promise of one. There was a line at the bottom of the packet, plain text, unadorned by any of the formality I'd expect from a diplomatic channel. Signal appears misrouted. Origin field corrupted. We are not your fleet. This is what we had that might help before your fleet arrives. I read that 4 times before I understood what it meant. We had not called them. We had called our own people, and gotten the address wrong by 2 digits, and a listening post on the other end of that error had looked at a dying signal from a species it didn't recognize, decided it did not need to know who we were, to decide the arithmetic was simple, and answered anyway, not with the fleet we'd asked for, because it wasn't theirs to send, but with the only thing that was. We mixed the compound that afternoon, working from a translated formula scrawled on the inside of a ration wrapper, because I didn't trust the rig's display in direct sun. We packed it into the breech in a ring, the way the schematic suggested, and reinforced the hull seam with what was left of the cargo struts, bent to the angles their diagnostic had specified. Kessel, propped against the bulkhead, watched me work, and said nothing for a long time, and then said the only thing he said that whole day, which was that he hoped whoever'd sent it understood we hadn't meant to trouble them. The ridge runners came at full dark, the way they always did, testing the perimeter first from a distance, the way they'd tested it every night since the crash. I heard the first one hit the deterrent ring before I saw it, a short, furious sound, more surprise than pain, and then the particular silence of something changing its mind mid-stride. It didn't come defeated, it didn't come gone, it came turned, diverted around the wreck instead of through it, the way water goes around a stone it can't move. 2 more tried the eastern edge an hour later, and got the same answer. By the deep hours of the night they'd stopped testing at all, and the only sound left was the ordinary sound of a jungle that had simply decided the wreck wasn't worth the trouble anymore. We held the night. Kessel held the night, propped against the bulkhead with the flare gun across his lap that he never had to use again, and I sat by the rig, listening to a perimeter that had gone, for the first time in 5 days, quiet, in the way quiet is supposed to sound. In the morning, an actual expeditionary fleet corvette came in low over the canopy, 4 days later than it should have, and exactly on schedule for how far off course our own header error had sent the real distress call before someone at command finally cross-referenced the wreckage transponder against the wrong coordinates and found us anyway. The corvette's medic took one look at Kessel's leg, and swore in a way I'd never heard an officer swear on an open channel. Nobody asked me about the ring of dried compound circling the hull breach. I don't think they even noticed it, low and unglamorous as it was against everything else in that clearing. I filed 2 reports when it was over. One to Expeditionary Command, routine, casualty count, cause of failure, recommendation that return address fields get a redundant checksum going forward. The other I filed nowhere official, because there was no address to file it to. Just a note, kept in my own record, that somewhere out past the edge of anything we'd mapped, a species we'd never contacted had received 411 garbled words never meant for them, worked out in less than a day what those words needed, and sent it without asking who we were or what we owed them for it. We did not aim the beacon at Earth. Earth answered anyway, by morning, with the one thing that was actually theirs to give.